Lucas Hale noticed the anomaly before the first cardboard box even touched the hardwood floor of his new foyer. It wasn't a sound that alerted him, but the complete and total absence of one. In any normal neighborhood, the Saturday afternoon air would be textured with life, the distant drone of a lawnmower, the rhythmic bass of a passing car, the chaotic shriek of children chasing a ball. Here, the silence was absolute. It was heavy, oppressive, and curated. He stepped out onto his porch, wiping sweat from his forehead, and looked down the street. It looked like a postcard printed on glossy paper, too saturated, too clean, and entirely static. Hey everyone, if you're watching this, I want to hear from you. Comment your city below. Stories like this happen everywhere, and I want to know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more true story-inspired HOA thrillers you won't hear anywhere else. When the neighbors finally appeared, the interaction felt less like a greeting and more like a synchronized routine. A woman 3 houses down paused while watering her hydrangeas, waited until Lucas made direct eye contact, and then waved. The motion was stiff, the smile engaging only the bottom half of her face. When he walked up the driveway to introduce himself to the couple next door, their conversation died instantly, severed as if by a switch. They pivoted toward him, smiling too quickly, their pleasantries delivered with the rapid-fire cadence of people following a script they were terrified to forget. No one was rude, in fact they were aggressively polite, but the warmth didn't reach their eyes. It felt rehearsed, a performance of suburbia, rather than the reality of it. By his third night, the silence had transitioned from awed to unnerving. He stood by his bedroom window, looking out at the street lamp-lit asphalt. There was no laughter drifting from open windows, no flickering blue light of televisions, no teenagers sneaking out. At exactly 10 o'clock, he watched as porch lights down the entire block clicked off in unison. It wasn't a cascade, it was simultaneous, as if a single finger had pressed a master button. Lucas tried to rationalize it. He told himself this was just the result of a highly efficient homeowners association, a community that took pride in order. But deep down, his instincts rebelled. Silence that organized doesn't happen by accident. It requires enforcement. Curiosity gnawed at him, pushing him out of his house 3 days later for a walk around the community center. The facility was immaculate, the pool water a chemically perfect turquoise, the deck chairs aligned with geometric precision. But as he rounded the corner, past the manicured hedges and the pristine maintenance sheds, the illusion of perfection cracked. Tucked away in a blind spot between the pool house and the equipment storage was a structure that didn't belong. It was a small, brutally functional cube of gray concrete. It had no windows, there was no signage, no authorized personnel only placard, just a reinforced steel door fitted with a commercial-grade keypad and a heavy deadbolt. The paint around the frame was fresh, and the concrete foundation looked significantly newer than the weathered brick of the surrounding buildings. That night, driven by a nagging suspicion he couldn't name, Lucas pulled up the official HOA site plans on his laptop. He zoomed in on the community center layout, tracing the lines of the pool, the gym, and the sheds. He checked the screen, then looked out his window toward the dark silhouette of the complex. The building wasn't on the map. Physically, it was an imposing reality of steel and stone. Officially, it didn't exist. He decided to test the waters at the monthly HOA meeting the following Tuesday. The atmosphere in the community hall was already stifling. Residents sat in rows with rigid posture, listening to a droning report on mulch density. When the floor opened for new business, Lucas stood up. He kept his tone breezy, casual. He asked about the windowless concrete building near the pool, wondering out loud if it was for extra storage. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The room didn't just go quiet, the energy in the space collapsed. Chairs creaked as people shifted their weight, leaning away from him as if he were contagious. A cough echoed loudly in the stillness. At the front of the room, Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, didn't flinch. She was a woman who wore authority like a suit of armor, her expression frozen in a mask of professional patience. She didn't look surprised by the question, she looked prepared for it. She smoothed her notes and spoke into the microphone, her voice devoid of inflection, stating that the area was not accessible to residents. When Lucas pressed, asking if it was a safety issue, she cut him off with a single word: compliance. She moved to the next agenda item without a pause, but the damage was done. Lucas scanned the faces of his neighbors. He expected to see relief that the awkward moment had passed. Instead, he saw raw fear. They weren't annoyed that he had wasted their time. They were terrified that he had drawn attention to the elephant in the room. The next afternoon, the mystery of the building deepened. Lucas walked past it again, this time stopping to inspect the ground. The landscaping in the neighborhood was obsessive, not a blade of grass out of place. Yet the earth directly in front of the steel door was worn down to hard-packed dirt. It was a scarred patch of land where footprints had layered over one another, indicating heavy traffic. People stood here often, and they stood close, perhaps close enough to listen to what was happening inside. The contrast was stark. Someone wanted access, and someone else wanted absolute discretion. That night, observing from the shadows of his patio, Lucas swore he saw the keypad illuminate, a brief flash of green light in the darkness, before the heavy door swallowed a shadow. He kept his vigil. Just after 9 in the evening, the figure of Jonah Reed, the HOA maintenance supervisor, emerged from the gloom. Jonah was a large man who usually moved with a heavy, confident gait, but tonight he looked skittish. He approached the concrete cube, glancing over his shoulder twice to scan the perimeter. He wasn't carrying a toolbox or cleaning supplies, just a thick, expandable file folder clutched tight against his chest. Jonah punched in the code, and the door opened just wide enough for him to slip inside. When it closed, the sound wasn't the metallic click of a latch, it was the dull thud of an airtight seal engaging. The next morning, Lucas decided to bypass the stonewalling of the board and go directly to the source of the neighborhood's history. Mrs. Evelyn Carter had lived on the corner lot for 30 years. She was the community historian, the woman who knew who had planted every oak tree. But when Lucas approached her while she was weeding her garden and gently brought up the concrete building, the transformation was heartbreaking. Her hands began to tremble so violently she dropped her trowel. She wouldn't look at him. She stared fixedly at the dirt, whispering that he shouldn't talk about that place, not inside his home, not out here, not ever. When Lucas pressed for a reason, she finally looked up, her eyes darting toward the community center as if the building itself had ears. She whispered that the room was how they kept things quiet. Then she turned her back on him and retreated inside, locking her door in the middle of a sunny morning. That night, the silence of the neighborhood was broken by a new sound, one Lucas only noticed because he was listening for it. Walking his dog past the concrete structure, he felt a vibration through the soles of his shoes before he heard it. It was a low, constant hum, mechanical and powerful. It wasn't the cycling of an air conditioner or a pool pump. It was the steady, relentless drone of industrial ventilation. It ran without pausing. When he woke at 3 a.m. and checked again, the hum was still there, a constant heartbeat in the dark. A thin strip of light bled out from beneath the doorframe. Someone was inside, or something was running that required uninterrupted power. Lucas decided to create a paper trail. He emailed the HOA official contact address, keeping his language polite and inquisitive. He mentioned the constant mechanical noise near the community center and asked for clarification on its purpose, framing it as a noise complaint. The response from Karen Whitmore arrived in under 2 minutes, a speed that suggested she had been waiting for it. There was no salutation, no apology for the disturbance. The message was terse. The area is restricted. Further inquiries may result in fines under HOA bylaws. It wasn't an explanation. It was a threat. The punishment for his curiosity arrived the very next morning. A bright orange violation notice was taped to his front door, fluttering in the breeze like a flag of war. The citation claimed his trash bins had been left out past permitted hours. Lucas immediately pulled up the footage from his doorbell camera. The timestamp was clear. He had wheeled the bins into the garage 20 minutes before sunset, well within the rules. The fine wasn't about trash. It was a message. Someone had watched him move the bins. Someone had waited for him to go to sleep to post the notice. It was a demonstration of surveillance, a way of telling him that truth didn't matter here, only obedience. Lucas didn't retreat. He dug in. He spent the next week combing through public records, archived newsletters, and cached versions of the community website. He began to construct a timeline of the neighborhood's history, and a disturbing pattern emerged. He found records of residents who had asked questions in meeting minutes, followed by logs of escalating fines for trivial or fabricated infractions. Those who appealed the fines lost every time. Those who pushed harder, threatening legal action or media involvement, inevitably sold their homes. The sales were always fast, often below market value, as if the owners were fleeing a burning building. In the internal enforcement notes, which he accessed through a vulnerability in the resident portal, one phrase appeared repeatedly next to the names of the evicted residents: resolved internally. The pressure mounted. One evening, Jonah Reed cornered Lucas in the dimly lit parking lot of the community center. The maintenance supervisor looked tired, his eyes rimmed with red. He stepped close, invading his personal space, but his voice was a hushed plea rather than a growl. He told Lucas to stop. He warned him that he didn't understand the machinery he was throwing wrenches into. When Lucas bluntly asked what was in the room, Jonah swallowed hard, looking at the concrete box in the distance. He said it was where problems went before they became outside problems. When Lucas asked if he meant police matters, Jonah didn't answer. He simply stated that people who didn't cooperate didn't last long, and then he walked away, leaving Lucas standing in the cold. It was in that moment that Lucas realized the true nature of the trap he was in. The secret room didn't exist solely because the HOA board was power-hungry. It existed because the neighbors, paralyzed by fear and dependent on property values, allowed it to exist. They were the bars of the cage. He went home and backed up every piece of footage, every downloaded record, and every threatening email to 3 separate cloud servers. He stopped planning to confront Karen or Jonah. That would only get him fined or forced out. He started planning an exposure. He knew that whatever was festering inside that concrete box relied on darkness to survive. It couldn't withstand the daylight. He didn't have to break in. That was the irony that would stick with him later. He simply waited for the quarterly inspection day, a date he found on the master calendar, when third-party vendors were allowed on site. He watched from his car as Jonah unlocked the steel door to let a pest control contractor in. When Jonah turned to sign a clipboard, Lucas slipped through the open gap, wearing a high-visibility vest he'd bought online and carrying a clipboard of his own. In the flurry of activity, he became invisible. He stepped across the threshold, and the heavy steel door swung shut behind him. The first thing that hit him was the air. It wasn't just cold, it was industrial cold, the kind of refrigerated chill used to preserve meat or electronics. It smelled of ozone and antiseptic cleaner. The space was smaller than he expected, but the layout was terrifying in its deliberation. There were no stacks of old lawn chairs or boxes of holiday decorations. The walls were lined with gray sound-dampening panels that sucked the noise from his breath.
In the center of the room, bolted to the concrete floor, was a long metal table. 2 folding chairs faced one another across it. One chair showed signs of wear, the other was pushed back, pristine and untouched. In the upper corner of the room, a camera lens stared down, its red recording light blinking with a steady, robotic rhythm. Lucas moved deeper into the room. Taped to the wall were laminated posters of HOA forms, enlarged like classroom rules. They bore titles that chilled his blood: Behavioral Compliance Review, Emergency Authorization Waiver, Internal Resolution Agreement. He scanned the text. The legal jargon was dense, but the intent was clear. None of these documents referenced law enforcement, mediation, or civil rights. None of them referenced consent. They were contracts of surrender. Against the far wall sat a heavy filing cabinet. Lucas pulled the top drawer open. The rails slid silently. Inside were dozens of folders, each labeled with a homeowner's name and address. He began to flip through them, his fingers numb from the cold. The notes were clinical and devastating. Uncooperative, escalated, emotional volatility noted. Some files were thin, containing only warnings and fines. Others were thick, stuffed with disturbing contents. He found medical disclosures that should have been private, psychological evaluations that weren't signed by any doctor, and handwritten observations about residents' stress responses. One file made him freeze. It belonged to a former neighbor, a man who had supposedly moved suddenly 2 years ago for a job transfer. He opened the folder. The exit note didn't mention a job. It read, "Agreed to sell. Non-disclosure agreement executed." Below it was a transcript of a session held in this very room. Lucas realized with a jolt of nausea that the neighbors hadn't just been fined into submission. They had been brought here, isolated and psychologically dismantled until they agreed to vanish. He turned back to the table, his eyes drawn to the floor near the occupied chair. The concrete was scuffed, the gray paint worn away in jagged streaks. There were indentations where the legs of the chair had been braced against the floor, suggesting force. And then he saw them, draped over the back of the chair. Restraints. They weren't medieval shackles. They were modern, medical-grade Velcro straps, padded, reusable, the kind designed to secure a patient for their own safety, the kind designed to leave no bruises, no physical evidence of the violence being inflicted.
Lucas turned to the computer terminal sitting on a small side desk, tapping the spacebar to wake the monitor. The screen flooded the dim room with a harsh blue light. He navigated to the video files, expecting a live feed, but found a meticulously organized archive instead. He clicked on a file dated 3 months prior. The footage was grainy, but the audio was crystal clear. It showed a resident, a man Lucas recognized from down the street, someone who always looked tired, sitting in the chair with the restraints loosely fastened. Karen Whitmore sat opposite him. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't even raising her voice. She was calmly reading from a list of potential financial liabilities that would befall the man's family if he didn't sign the document in front of him. The man was weeping, quietly, his head in his hands. Lucas clicked through another file and another. It was a montage of capitulation. Meetings that were ostensibly compliance reviews were actually masterclasses in psychological siege warfare. He watched residents sitting alone while Karen's voice filled the room, outlining the destruction of their credit scores, the liens on their properties, the ruin of their reputations. Some cried, some tried to argue logic against a wall of bureaucratic nonsense. Eventually, they all signed. One file was different. A man refused to pick up the pen. He stood up, shouting that he was leaving. The recording ended abruptly. Lucas checked the date against the property records he had memorized. That man's house had been listed for sale 3 weeks later. The realization hit Lucas with the force of a physical blow. This room wasn't designed for punishment. Punishment implies a crime and a sentence. This room was a pressure vessel. It was an environment engineered to isolate a human being, to strip away their sense of agency, and to overwhelm them with the crushing weight of manufactured authority. There were no bruises because physical violence was inefficient. It was far more effective to convince someone they were alone, that no one outside these concrete walls would help them, and that the only way to make the pain stop was to comply. The HOA didn't enforce rules here, they broke resistance. Lucas pulled a flash drive from his pocket. His hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, hard anger. He plugged it in and began to copy everything. He didn't release the flood of data all at once. He knew that a dump of documents might be dismissed as a conspiracy theory or a hoax. He needed something visceral. He chose a single image, a high-resolution still frame from the room's camera. It showed a resident sitting alone at the bolted table, the red recording light glowing like a malevolent eye in the corner, surrounded by the intimidating sprawl of compliance forms. He posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group with no names and no accusations, just a simple caption regarding the amenities near the pool. The reaction was seismic. Within hours, the digital silence of the community shattered. People recognized the room, they recognized the table. More importantly, they recognized the feeling of the room. The comments didn't explode with outrage initially, but with a collective, terrifying validation. Neighbors who had suffered in silence, believing they were the only ones who had been called into that concrete box, suddenly realized they were part of a pattern. The fear that had kept them quiet fractured. Karen Whitmore tried to control the narrative. She issued an emergency bulletin before the sun had even set, claiming the image was taken out of context and that the room was a private mediation space designed for sensitive discussions. She threatened legal action against anyone spreading misinformation. But in her haste to silence the leak, she made a fatal strategic error. She confirmed the room existed. That was the foothold the local press needed. Reporters, sensing blood in the water, descended on the neighborhood. The question wasn't about HOA bylaws anymore. It was about why a housing association required a soundproof bunker with a recording system and restraints. By nightfall, Karen Whitmore had stopped answering her phone. The dam broke the next morning when Mrs. Evelyn Carter stepped onto her porch to speak to a reporter. She was the first domino. She didn't describe physical abuse, she described the terror of the pressure. She spoke of being told her health issues were a liability risk to the community image, of being advised to consider relocation while the camera blinked at her. She described signing documents she didn't understand just to be allowed to leave the cold room. Her testimony gave permission for others to speak. One by one, the stories poured out. Different faces, different infractions, but the same room, the same table, and the same calm voice explaining the consequences of disobedience. Officer Nina Alvarez didn't arrive with sirens blaring. She arrived with a quiet convoy of unmarked cars and a folder of search warrants. The scene was clinical. The community center was cordoned off with yellow tape. The servers were disconnected and bagged. The steel door was photographed, measured, and cataloged, transformed from a myth into evidence. When they led Karen Whitmore out of the office, it was in broad daylight. She didn't resist. She walked with her head high, insisting to the officer that everything was standard policy, that it was all for the good of the property values. She clung to the word policy like a shield, but it offered her no protection against the handcuffs. The legal reckoning was swift and brutal. Civil suits piled up faster than the court clerks could file them. False imprisonment, coercion, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, unlawful surveillance. The HOA's insurance provider took one look at the evidence and refused coverage, citing criminal acts. Board members resigned in a cascade of finger-pointing, claiming ignorance, until the emails Lucas had uncovered proved they had signed off on every budget request for security upgrades. Jonah Reed took a plea deal in exchange for testimony. He admitted that the room had been designed with the help of a disbarred lawyer to skate the absolute edge of legality, using intimidation tactics that were technically contractual but morally repugnant. That edge had finally snapped.
In the months that followed, the neighborhood underwent a physical and spiritual dismantling. The concrete building was torn down. The heavy steel door was hauled away for scrap. Residents walked past the empty shell where it had stood, staring at the raw earth like it was a grave. At first, no one spoke about it openly. The trauma was too fresh. But slowly, the rehearsed smiles faded, replaced by genuine, messy human interaction. People started talking over fences again. They shared the stories they had been too ashamed to whisper. The HOA was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay the settlements. The rules about grass height and trash bins remained on paper, but the fear that enforced them had evaporated. Lucas didn't move, he didn't run for the new board, and he didn't give interviews after the trials concluded. He simply continued to live there, a visible, present reminder of what had happened. The side of the room was eventually cleared completely. In its place, the new community committee installed a simple park bench. There was no plaque, no memorial explanation. It was just a place to sit in the open air, right where the steel door once stood. Lucas sat there often, watching the neighborhood breathe. He knew the truth now. The most dangerous rooms aren't the ones hidden in underground bunkers or secret lairs. They are the ones right in front of us, the ones everyone agrees not to look inside. This time, the door would stay open.